So yesterday we learned that Ayo Dosunmu, after returning for just one game, has been ruled out for the remainder of the season and will have surgery on his left shoulder. This, of course, after Ayo had missed the last 3 games before being cleared to play and returning in that win over the Toronto Raptors. And in that game, while Ayo still played decently well, he had that steal and transition dunk in overtime that all but sealed the win for the Bulls. But in that game, you could clearly see that Ayo wasn't right. He wasn't his usual self in handling the ball, his release looked off, and at times you would even kind of see him favoring that arm and shoulder. And then a day and a half later, just hours leading up to the Indiana Pacers game, they do some further imaging and revealed instability in that shoulder capsule that had actually occurred a long time ago and continued to worsen over time. And because it's gotten to this point, Ayo is now looking at a multi-month rehab which will extend well into the summer and possibly even into training camp of next year. Now, sure, things happen like this from time to time, right? Where a player has a seemingly minor injury, the pain isn't getting any better, and the medical staff does some further analysis, and they realize, yeah, it's worse than what we initially anticipated, and they recommend a surgery to fix the problem. We've seen that happen throughout NBA history. It's still rare, and I would still argue it's medical malpractice by not doing your due diligence to diagnose an injury properly from the get-go, especially at this level of professional basketball, but it happens from time to time. What is incredibly rare, and I would even say damn near unprecedented, is when it happens multiple times across multiple seasons from a single franchise. And yes, the franchise I'm referring to is the Chicago Bulls, a team that has had a history of medical missteps over the course of the past decade and beyond that are seemingly swept under the rug and never looked into as to why this keeps happening. Why do we keep seeing these scenarios where the Bulls players are misdiagnosed or there's little transparency into what's going on? The public is told, yeah, everything is okay, they're recovering nicely, the recovery is on schedule to then. Oh, just kidding. They're actually going to be out for the entire season. Why does this keep happening? Well, let's talk about it. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Apologies for not getting a post-game video out on the Bulls-Pacers game last night, like I mentioned in a recent video. Given the rest of the season is kind of a wash and somewhat uneventful, I won't be having post-game videos after every game, but we'll do my best to still get out content to you guys. But as I said, leading up to that game, just a few hours before tip-off, we learned that Ayo was going to be out for the season, which is a huge blow, not only for the Bulls, but Ayo being one of the Bulls' young core players that we obviously want to continue to develop as we head down a path of rebuilding. But to me, what was more concerning was how we've seen this type of scenario play out all too often when it comes to this organization and their medical history. I mean, let's just go back a few seasons. Last season, we saw a scenario where Patrick Williams was out for a few games due to a foot injury, which, mind you, prior to going out, he was playing some of the best basketball of his career. If you don't believe me, just go back and look up some of the game logs prior to that injury. But he would miss a game because he was experiencing some foot pain in his foot, comes back, plays 3 games, doesn't look like himself at all, sits another 2 games after that as a quote-unquote precaution at that time. They called it precaution and that it wasn't anything serious. They clear him to play. He plays another 4 games, again, just doesn't look right, doesn't have the same mobility as before, doesn't have that quick first step. They sit him out for a couple of games as another precaution, even though we start seeing Pat walking in a boot. And then a few days later, they announce Patrick Williams is going to miss the rest of the season. How about Zach LaVine last season? And I would even go as far as to say Zach LaVine's entire tenure in Chicago, where he had injuries that were said to be minor, but then he would miss considerable time. But the one in particular that stands out was that surgery he had last season. Zach initially played the first 18 games without incident, even though he wasn't playing well and didn't look fully healthy, would then miss over a month of games. This, of course, was when all the drama was surrounding the trade rumors of Zach and the Bulls trying to find him a new home. He comes back, plays 7 games, looks better, but something was off, as that quick first step of his just wasn't there. His leaping ability didn't look the same, so the Bulls rule him out for a short period of time. Then a couple weeks later, they announced that Zach, not the Bulls, but Zach LaVine, has opted for season-ending surgery in his knee that had been continuing to nag him throughout that season. Now, at first, there were rumors on whether or not Zach opted to have the surgery intentionally because he didn't want to be traded to the Pistons, who were the worst team in the league at that time. It was reported that the Bulls were unhappy or didn't agree with his decision to have that season-ending surgery, which, to be fair to Zach, I mean, players don't opt to have surgery unless it's absolutely necessary. You're not going to risk going under the knife to try and get out of not being traded. But regardless, another case where the Bulls medical staff has mishandled yet another injury where it wasn't properly diagnosed, and Zach LaVine opted to get a second opinion from a third party and choose to have surgery, which we've seen the benefits that came from having that surgery. Zach LaVine looked like a completely different player this season. Back to his old former all-star, incredibly efficient scorer, the hops and the athleticism back to where we're used to seeing it. So the surgery was the right way to go for Zach LaVine to get fully healthy again. Now, of course, we can't forget everything that went down with Lonzo Ball and him being out for 2.5 seasons. Yes, to be fair, a lot of that the medical staff really could not control. Lonzo's injury was incredibly unique, and the fact that he's even been able to return to the court and return to form is a miracle in and of itself, considering he was the first player to ever come back from this procedure and getting an entirely new knee. But to me, it was more so the way it was handled and the level of transparency around it. Like, if you remember, it all started as a bone bruise. He had an estimated timeline to return of 6 to 8 weeks, then that was extended, then they announced he wouldn't be back for the remainder of the season, including the playoffs, but the expectation was, well, he'll be ready to go by training camp. Then it was, well, he's going to miss the first few weeks of the season. Then it was the first half of the season. They can't figure out what's going on. He's still experiencing pain every time he ramps up his rehab, and then it quickly turned into he's going to be out for the rest of the season. Oh, and by the way, there's a high likelihood he's going to miss the rest of next season as well. Like, Lonzo had to go to his own doctors and seek treatment there to get where he is today, as the Bulls medical staff was befuddled and could not figure out what was wrong with his knee. And look, while we all criticize AK, and rightfully so, for how, he's managed things with this team since he's taken over, but I can't help but think if perhaps he would have approached things differently, if the medical staff was more clear, more transparent in the expectations of Lonzo's return, that it wasn't going to be anytime soon. Because AK likely saw what this team was capable of when Lonzo was in the lineup. And if Lonzo was able to get back that following season, which was the expectation at that time, it's likely why they didn't really do much in terms of making changes to the roster, because they thought they had something with Lonzo back on this team. Now, as I've said before, that's still been their biggest mistake in not reacting quick enough or having a plan B should Lonzo not return. But if the medical staff is advising the front office poorly and not managing expectations and timelines for a return, that's on them, as they're supposed to be the expert in that field, not AK or Mark Eversley. Now, of course, there are instances of medical malpractice by the Bulls dating all the way back to Derrick Rose. Of course, the situation with Luol Deng and his spinal tap, which it came out later that wasn't necessary, and Deng considered suing the team. Granted, it's a new medical staff now. It's even further, the Bulls revamped their medical staff this offseason, and we were all like, okay, great. We need new people in these roles, because we're consistently seeing this team getting injured and injuries being handled improperly. But then we see the injury happen to Ayo, and I won't be shocked if we learn that Patrick Williams will be out for the rest of the season in just a few days, right before he's scheduled to return. And so the same thing keeps happening. The medical malpractice that we've been seeing for years. And so it makes you wonder, what the hell is going on inside this organization? Is it because ownership is cheap and they're not hiring the best talent to be in these types of roles? Are they not training the players properly? I don't know. I don't know what it is, but we've seen this play out with this team far too many times, and it should be investigated and looked into further. I doubt the Bulls are going to do anything about it because they rarely address or admit when they've made mistakes, but it's a huge concern for the future of this team if you don't have the proper medical staff in place, because regardless of the level of talent you have, regardless of the Bulls somehow turning things around and landing generational talents in the draft in the future, it's only going to get you so far if your doctors aren't taking care of the players and it's impacting their careers. Just my take on the matter, but I would love to hear what you guys think. You let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.